I've always been interested in the kind of idiosyncrasies and the sheer almost absurdity of like a handmade reproduction. But it's never kind of an exclusive dependency. It's not like a photorealistic interest whereby, to me, the photorealists were coming from a pretty like idiomatically American perspective, kind of responding to consumer culture and this sort of throwaway snapshot aesthetic, especially in the '60s, that had become like the Kodachrome cameras and the sort of disposable Polaroids. Snapshot culture really kind of started having its real genesis in the like mid-century, mid-20th century America, where the photorealists were kind of like working, and they even had kind of like sort of conventions or credos that they would sort of even have like a photorealistic kind of manifesto where they would kind of dictate the aesthetic terms by which their material would be selected, and a lot of it had to do with kind of like a non-posed kind of situation that they're trying to describe, where it was somehow kind of considered sort of like very, like kind of like an immediate experience that they were trying to reproduce, like something that was like not conceived of in terms of art, and then they would sort of like put it through this kind of extremely labor-intensive process of translation. So as a way to, in a sense, not glorify, but kind of raise questions about that sort of anti-aesthetic of composition. And I am very interested in the kind of like the effects of snapshot culture, or what I refer to as the immanent archive that kind of happens in contemporary culture, especially where things are like automatically, like almost immediately recorded and archived. So I'm interested in the idea of like how this archive is changing our memories, and it's something that this dude wrote a lot about, and because I think it's having a profound effect on us as kind of people, like how we conceive of even like making a memory, or how we conceive of even doing research, or having a kind of like what we consider a real experience. So. So under those terms, it's like these images really have nothing to do with photorealism. That's based on my definition of photorealism, because the process that that's like I was kind of saying before, the process that by which I make these things, I always feel like even these much more specific images have a much stronger relationship in my mind to surrealism than to photorealism, just because of the kind of space not space. That's what I always like to call it. It's like space not space. It's simultaneously eliciting a sense of atmosphere or solidity, but at the same time it kind of destroys it or does away with it. That's usually through a process of also like research. It's not simply like kind of looking at who the people are or what they look like. It's not an aesthetic process of like sort of choosing a particular face or a gender or an ethnicity. It's more of like an idea of like reading a book, or it's sort of very organic. It's sort of like letting interests flow, and it happens conversationally too. I have to say, like I'm always interested in talking to people about the project, which is sort of my emphasis in applying for residencies at this point, is the idea of like interdisciplinarity involved in those atmospheres, and actually talking to people in a sense like finding potential subjects through a process of kind of comparing notes, like. If there's any subjects that other people might think are interesting to add to this kind of cosmology, I don't want to render people that are really sort of vile in a way as like all too human. The idea of like really empathizing with them, or presenting the idea of like. Presenting sort of the human perspective or the human story of like, kind of in a sense like trying to portray them as good. And on the one hand, I'm sort of interested in just the portraits, the idea of like these things being kind of visual counterpoints to these other kinds of images that are just left empty or left as just statements. Like the idea of like, you have like the purely pictorial in the traditional sense in the images, and then you have this kind of like decentered pictorial, which is presented by text. Like text is inherently pictorial as well, but it can elicit, you know, an image in a different way. So I like that, you know, these individuals can function as everybody or nobody, in addition to who they actually are, if someone does research or knows who they are. So I sort of feel like I'm pretty confident in that they'll work, even if the specifics of who they are not translated. These two guys definitely go together in terms of like him writing about kind of like, you know, these sort of non-spaces as fictions, and Virilio being a kind of like a critic of technology, and also speed. I mean, he's a guy that's kind of like argued about the kind of perceptual effects of increasingly rapid transmission of information and also rapid transmission of ourselves, really. And what kind of like effect it has on our memories and also our perceptions of physical space. And so I thought that these guys, in a sense, are almost like writing about this non-space in relationship to Aung San Suu Kyi, who has largely been sort of a political product, or has, in a sense, very much benefited from these evolving technologies on a global scale. I mean, the only reason that the Burmese junta didn't kill her outright is because of the kind of the martyr issue. I mean, that's the only reason they let her go in the end. So then like the idea also, like physically, like her, in a sense, being like emblematic of resistance against totalitarianism, but being in effect like an icon of that, and nothing more. Like sort of like the, you know, where is Aung San Suu Kyi? Who is she? You know that sort of physicality has been sort of subsumed by the cult of personality, and was actually like figuratively and literally in limbo for 20 years, and I thought that was kind of fascinating as kind of like a subtext. It's these I almost consider these more self-portraits than anything else, and I'm hoping that with like that first-person directive, that perhaps a viewer could read them as first-person narratives as well, so they can maybe internalize them. But I'm not really sure if that's as effective as like using like a you directive, you know, like you are this. But I don't want it to be like the voice of God. The fear of immobilization or helplessness on one level, but also sort of like the power of, I guess you could say like the sort of like the big other, this kind of, you know, amorphous totality of like culture or your city or your community or whatever, like something that exists outside of yourself that in some respects has a direct manifestation or effect on how you behave or what your possibilities are. So I really felt like the Gorgon is particularly in the sense of like, you know, it being emblematic of a fear of immobilization was appropriate to my general feeling of, you know, and I've been reading about this. I've been feeling like this ever since I was a kid, but I've also been reading about it, especially over like the last. I don't know if it's millennialism or if like you know, the year 2000 happened and everyone started freaking out. You know, like within the 10 years of that happening, there's been lots of talks about sort of like the inefficiency or ineffectiveness of like political activism or populist uprisings, revolution, all these kinds of things that are sort of like potential challenges to the problematic system that we've erected for ourselves. So I think that in a sense, like this sense of immobilization has been made manifest culturally. It just exists everywhere. This kind of, that's what I talked about as this knife's edge feeling, where we're perpetually just sort of hanging, like. And it always seems that like, the stakes kind of keep getting higher and higher and higher. Everything, everywhere from sort of like, atomic, what's the word I'm looking for? Atomic deterrence to ecological disaster. It's like the stakes keep raising, and it's just sort of still like, this sort of weird balancing act. And I could you just read from like everybody, like Critchley to Badiou to Zizek to Judith Butler, all these people are kind of like trying to, you know, find potential pathways through this impasse, this kind of conceptual notion of like what do we do with culture? How do we change things? How do we really, in a sense, like move to the next step without, in a sense, just kind of like reinvigorating the power structures that already exist. So that in a sense, like that, you know, I feel like in many respects we are as a culture kind of frozen, or at least I really feel that way. And Deadly Equilibrium kind of talks about that too. It's like normally I kind of feel like people refer to equilibrium as like a positive thing. You maintain an equilibrium, but to me it's like, you know, maybe an equilibrium can go too far. Sometimes maybe you just need a precipitous, you know, like tip, you know, just for better or for worse.